Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to get started now. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a really exciting talk and discussion about sexuality and gender issues in Taiwan and Southeast Asia today. My name is Susan Burns. I'm a professor of Japanese history here at the University of Chicago, and I'm also the director of the Center for East Asian Studies. I'll be introducing tonight's speaker and moderating the Q&A. The Center for East Asian Studies is pleased to be cooperating once again with the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Chicago, which is otherwise known by its acronym TECO, to present lectures that showcase important scholarship about Taiwan. We are grateful to co-sponsor this event with support from the Taiwanese Ministry of Culture and TECO through their dedicated Spotlight Taiwan program. We have two representatives from TECO with us this evening, Directors David Dong and Daniel Hung. Thank you both for helping to make this event possible. For more information on the activities of TECO, please visit their website, which is provided in the chat box. And I'd like to invite you to learn more about the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies. You can visit us at our website, cease.uchicago.edu, where you can subscribe to receive our weekly e-bulletin to learn more about wonderful events like this. And these links are also provided in our chat box. We will be using the Q&A box for a discussion this evening. Please feel free to enter your questions at any point during the talk or during the discussion, and I'll be sure to convey them to Dr. Lee. So finally, I'm truly delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Po-Han Lee is an assistant professor in the Global Health Program at Taiwan National University. Previously, he taught sociology and criminology and gender studies at the University of Sussex in the UK, where he received his PhD. He is the editor-in-chief of the Plain Law Movement in Taiwan, really fascinating initiative to discuss current events from the perspective of law in ordinary, accessible language. Professor Lee has published extensively in both Chinese and English. Some of his recent works include The Demagogies of Lack, the WHO's Ambivalence to the Right of Health of LGBT People. That was published in Global Health Governance. He also has published a very interesting article called Queer Activism in Taiwan, an Emergent Rainbow Coalition from the Assemblage Perspective in the Sociological Review. And a third article is LGBT Rights versus Virgin Values, Reconstructing the Universality of Human Rights, which appeared in the International Journal of Human Rights. And I think that gives you a bit of insight into the really fascinating work that he's doing. Professor Lee's talk this evening is called Ambivalence and Assemblage, Queer Activisms in Taiwan in Transnational Southeast Asia. So I will turn things over to Professor Lee, and I look forward to this evening's discussion.
Thank you, Susan, for such a wonderful introduction. I'm going to share my screen with you all. And yeah, so good evening, people in the United States, and good morning from Taiwan, because we definitely have really huge gap. So it wasn't easy to organize the whole events, inviting everyone in different places. So hi everyone. Yeah. So as Susan just mentioned, my name is Po-Han Lee, and I'm now teaching at National Taiwan University with regard to especially social determinants of health and also relevant human rights issues. And I would like to thank the Center for East Asian Studies of University of Chicago for organizing this event, and to different people, all of you from the center who have been offering so much support in various aspects. Because I myself, I'm not really good at technology, so they've been supporting me so much. So it is my great honor and pleasure to have this opportunity to present my work to a larger audience through this presentation. Today in my talk, I will be looking at how queer politics has emerged in East Asia in the context where the LGBT rights discourse and activism have been globalized, while the state-sponsored queerphobic actions under the banner of cultural sovereignty also emerged and gets more serious at the same time. So as Susan wonderfully mentioned that I have published different case studies and reflections with regard to queer activism for visibility, for human rights protection, and for health equality in Taiwan or other East Asian societies, with an analytical framework informed by the Deleuzean assemblage theory. And these works have drawn on my observations, especially at Taiwan LGBT Pride from 2011 to 2015, and the 6th ALGA Asia Conference in 2015 held in Taipei as well as many unstructured interviews with participants, including those who I met again many times between 2016 to 2018 due to the Queer Asia conferences held at the SOAS University of London. So all of these activists have been converged again and again and to discuss and share what they have observed and what kind of strategies they have been undertaken, as well as some other random conversations with many other LGBTQ activists and scholars at other conferences. So the news reports and also public records, which record our dialogues or these events regarding the representations of sexual and gender minority populations, not only on social media, but also mainstream media, are also a really great source of data. At the same time, I've been looking at the media and political discourses around this and how the government has been responding to these situations. So by saying Southeast Asia, I'm not simply referring to Taiwan, China, Mongolia, Japan, and both Koreas, which was classified by the United Nations for statistical convenience. In fact, among these jurisdictions, I pay more attention to Taiwan, Japan, and China. At the same time, I've been also very interested in the situations regarding LGBT rights discourse and its development in Southeast Asia. In fact, through this presentation, a relatively minor point, I want to challenge the geopolitical delimitation between Southeast Asia and East Asia, which are, at least in terms of queer activism and its development, very closely related to each other and almost indivisible. An approach that takes the intercultural and transnational elements into account becomes necessary when I was conducting my research in order to capture the diversity, at the same time interconnectedness within this regime. Therefore, the slash here between two Asias represent a geographical meaning, but also a geopolitical indication. So now let me use some time to introduce to you queer assemblage theory, what I mean by that. So based on Deleuze's assemblage theory, which has been interpreted and applied by different social scientists, cultural theorists, and philosophers in many different ways. Assemblage, this concept has been used by Deleuze and Guattari themselves variably as well over time, which was initially developed from another concept, body without organs. Here I mainly follow Manuel de Landa's version, trying to capture the interactions between queer activists and between them and others. Here, when I say others, which they can be national governments, national representatives in international organizations, international stakeholders, minority members which these activists represent, and the general public of each society. So I found it really interesting to see how they respond to the defenders of so-called cultural traditions and how they think of human rights discourse in the matrix of global sexuality and gender politics. As an assemblage, you can see the resemblance of queer activism is like a constellation. This means that it is always transforming in the state of becoming, and such a transformation can be spontaneous, contingent. However, its movement is not necessarily always unpredictable, as long as we can identify the capacities of the assemblage's components, the discourses they have employed, as well as the materiality conditions that structure the movements of the moments of movement. An assemblage, some people would also describe as a rhizome, metaphorically. An assemblage can be understood as extending to as far-reaching as possible and encompassing many intertwined components. So the key concern for an assemblage analysis is to identify the connecting points of components, the nodes. All the components reinforce and have effect upon each other wherever they are attached to the assemblage. Meanwhile, these components retain great autonomy as well, which allows each of them to freely detach from the assemblage. As an analytical approach to social transformation, the assemblage perspective, as I apply it, contains three primary sets of elements. They are contextual elements, expressive elements, and the material elements. Although the contextual element was not made explicit in DeLanda's theory, but it has been implied by quoting a lot of sociologists, including Anthony Giddens' definition of locales, where the properties of settings are employed in a chronic way by agents in the constitution of encounters across space and time. So following this perspective, I'd like to start with queer activism in Taiwan, which serves an interesting case in Southeast Asia, including its transformation in a post-Cold War era, or more specifically, in a context where the democratic transition takes place around the abolition of martial law in 1987. Following this, I will link the Taiwan case to a larger context regarding the sexuality politics in East Asia. In the Taiwan's case, I've been paying attention to the way in which the renaissance of sexual conservatism, which has been mixed with Confucianism and Christianity, stimulates the components of sexual rights movement to remerge, to reterritorialize, and form an assemblage larger than it used to be. For such a formation of assemblage, I have named it as Rainbow Coalition. I also found that in such a coalition, each component, either individuals or organizations, are pursuing not just visibility and empowerment, but also a greater leverage to influence social and political agendas by means of exchanging, accumulating, and converting various forms of capitals through their own interactions. In line with the anxiety of being a Taiwanese against the domination and control from the West, from China, and even for some people from the strange existence of the Republic of China government. The Rainbow Coalition relies on, and in turn, provides the soil for a cosmopolitan identity of Taiwanese-ness to grow. It is a process of self-determination and self-liberation driven by the hardship that Taiwanese people have faced since the 1970s when the ROC government was expelled by the United Nations. So a social movement for sexual and gender minorities in Taiwan was pioneered by a sexual liberation movement along with women's rights movement. Since the 1990s, it has faced a competition in terms of knowledge production and activism agenda setting between the heterogeneous groups, especially when the LGBT rights as human rights discourse became very popular in Taiwan. So all of this should be understood against a larger background regarding the ups and downs of cross-strait tension, despite the end of the Chinese Civil War, as well as the triangular complicated relationship between Taiwan, China, and the United States. This is where I started to think about the notion of Taiwanese-ness. As mentioned earlier, most social movements developed rapidly since the martial law was lifted, swaying between a cultural root of Confucius Han Chinese mannerism and the desire for Western modernity, including the ideas of individual rights and liberties. In this context, the general public in Taiwan has been ambivalent towards not only the unruly social activists for rights, but also those who claim to offer an orthodox interpretation of traditional virtues. Such an ambivalence formulates a special version of cosmopolitan identity. It is a hybridity of various forms of cultural and national essentialism, as well as a post-colonial stance against external forces. It is a collective nationalistic sentiment. In this kind of sentiment, emotional responses to China, the United States, and the rest of the world coexist and compete with each other. Why I claim that such a sentiment is ambivalence is because these emotional responses are not always coherent, among which the expressive elements of Taiwanese-ness have been deconstructed and reconstructed due to various historical moments, repeatedly self-producing and reaffirming its own existence. Researching and attempting to map out the trajectory of a social movement is not an easy task, but because it can be too complicated for there are many aspects as cutting points. So besides a historical review, I started with the Pride parades in Taiwan, since the Pride event has always played a symbolic role as a convergent point of collective forces for sexual and gender minorities. The Pride 2011 was themed with LGBT Fight Back, Discrimination Get Out. This was a response to an earlier event in the same year, a curriculum program on sexual health and gender equality proposed by LGBT rights organizations faced great opposition from homophobic and transphobic groups. Since 2012, when the Pride started to popularize the idea regarding marriage revolution, marriage equality, partner diversity, more and more groups of people have been mobilized to publicly show their support for heteronormative family values, which are against what the LGBT activists have been advocating. These people consist of people who appropriate and combine the ideologies of both Christianity and Confucianism regarding gender binarism and corresponding social roles, family formations, the responsibilities of both parents and offspring, and sexual repression. I therefore call them neoconservativists because their ideologies are not purely the representation of Christianity, neither traditionally Chinese. In 2013, queer activists brought up another agenda, which has been considered more radical, seeing homosexuality 2.0, companion for sexual refugees, as that year's Pride theme. Refugees in such a narrative are referred to those whose sexual practices and erotic desires do not conform to, but suffer from both heteronormativity and homonormativity. The marginal of these minorities include people who engage in chemsex, bear subcultures, polyamory, BDSM practices, and sex work. Such a very liberationist perspective was formally introduced to the general public, pushing subcultures on streets. Doing so actually has provoked the disgust and shame, not just by general public, but also from gay people themselves, and has intriguingly stimulated many new LGBT organizations which claim to be clean LGBT people to be formed and aiming explicitly at distinguishing themselves from those unruly, non-normative ones, which are called by these clean LGBT people as radicals and bad gay. So this was a very interesting development. Different groups of people living in Taiwan all underwent a journey of democratization, regardless where they were from. They were seeking some kind of subjectivity in terms of national and cultural selves in the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War. Between Chinese unification and Taiwanese independence, being a Taiwanese per se has become a question that has been problematized all the time by Taiwanese people themselves. Along with a growing sense of self-determination, the identity discourse of Taiwanese-ness has been a space in which different groups of people compete to define and contribute. It has been interpreted and represented in the various manners by not just queer activism, but many other social movements. In this context, a dialectic approach to becoming Taiwanese has emerged recently in social mobilizations, which has been interpreted actually as becoming non-Chinese. Based on my findings of interviewing activists from different organizations, many groups have gradually shifted their focus from confronting those neoconservativists to engaging with the public. Bypassing the persistent opponents had become a new strategy, especially between 2010 and 2016. And this has foregrounded a political context in which marriage equality campaign could have gained increasing support from the society and in the end achieved its success. In addition to categorizing activism into formal and lay politics undertaken by different organizations, queer activists have demonstrated the outlying positions with other social and political struggles. For instance, environmental and anti-nuclear movements, the disability rights movement. A notable example is the presence of queer activists and rainbow flag during the Sunflower Student Movement in 2014, against the ratification of the Quad-Strait Service Trade Agreement with China. Another example can be the anti-textbook revision movement in 2015, against a Han-Chinese-centric historical view. These two movements have been considered as the moments defining Taiwanese-ness through civil disobedience actions against the shades of China's centrism. Taiwanese-ness per se, from a state-centric perspective on international relations, which we define as the relations between states. Actually, Taiwanese has become queer existence, side by side with the suffering-based normativity, feeling ambivalence towards normalization or self-determination. As for the status quo, nothing can be fixed and stable. Living with Chinese traditions, Japanese legacies, Western influences, and indigenous cultures, the conceptualized Taiwanese-ness should take the anti-China nationalistic sentiment into account, but cannot be taken as a national identity yet. Rather, it is more like a sense of solidarity for a group of different peoples of different ideologies who cooperate, at the same time compete with each other, but also live together against the Westphalian, the state-centric norms. Interestingly, queer activists combine the queerness of being Taiwanese and their own sexual identities to coin a concept, rainbow citizenship, which has mitigated its original radicalness into a resonance of peaceful self-determination and diversity as social harmony. Echoing the mainstream political ideologies regarding multiculturalism and transitional justice and human rights discourse in the conceptualizing process of Taiwanese-ness, the queer politics in Taiwan has gradually transformed from confrontational to calling for democratization of intimacies. A mixture of political and sexual identities is even more obvious when the self-inscribed Rempel citizens were integrated into and recognized by the government as Rembo people, with others at the new president's inauguration on May 20th, 2016. Rembo now becomes a symbol of Taiwanese solidarity as a whole. It's like saying that we are the same people living on the same land wherever we were from and going to. Potentially, a rainbow coalitional politics may be formed to encompass sexual and gender minorities and other socially disadvantaged groups, as well as the Taiwanese citizens who feel oppressed by the Chinese authoritarian regime. By employing the term coalition, I'm not using it as a descriptor only, but intend to mean a composition of the Letian assemblage, which nots different singularities on a plane traversed by external and internal lines of forces within and outside the society. That is to say, the Rainbow Coalition is composed of the desire for democratic transition as its contextual elements, and the undefinable Taiwanese as its expressive element. Its material elements include the new politics, such as the emergence of social media, the social and political capital possessed by LGBT members or pro-LGBT rights scholars and politicians. A process of reconfiguring LGBT rights movements has reached out to collaborate with other pro-democracy and anti-China mobilizations. This has not only promoted queer activism's leverage power against the conservativists, but also translated minority experiences into the rights language and a sense of injustices, depending on the context of the engagement of queer activism with the public. Having say that, of course, social movements in Taiwan could not happen out of vacuum, considering the insights drawing from connected sociologies. Since 2013, when the United Nations launched the Free and Equal campaign throughout the world, almost every UN-related agency has worked on educating governments how to treat sexual and gender minority populations properly. Ban Ki-moon, the then United Nations Secretary General, defined this struggle as the neglected human rights challenge of our time at the launch of this campaign. Thereafter, in 2015, the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, has launched a regional project, Being LGBTI in Asia, which was aiming at addressing inequality, violence, and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status, and aiming at promoting universal access to health and social services, which almost set up the activism agenda for people in this region. Meanwhile, the United States has set LGBT rights as one of its foreign policy priorities. Under the Obama administration, the Secretary of State appointed Randy Barry as the first special envoy for the human rights of LGBT persons in 2015. And despite the Trump's aggression against LGBT people and other sexual and gender diversity populations, this policy hasn't been changed. After a round trip in Asia in early 2016, while praising Taiwan's achievements in terms of LGBT rights, Mr. Randy Barry singled out Indonesia, for example, with a special concern at a speech in March. 2 days later, Mr. Randy was awarded by the Outright Action International for championing human rights for LGBTI people around the world. On March 4th, 2016, Indonesia's Communications and Information Ministry announced a draft bill banning all websites which spread LGBT propaganda. Under pressure, this policy was under pressure of the House of Representatives Commission. In an interview, the commission's chairman told the Jakarta Post that LGBT issues can damage national security, identity, culture, and the faith of Indonesians. Although homosexuality is not illegal, except there are prohibitions upon Muslims in 2 provinces. And traditionally, a vibrant transgender culture is accepted. Things has been changed radically recently. The defense minister described the LGBT rights movement as a modern warfare waged by Western nations. The vice president, raged by a fight for equal marriage rights, urges to cut funding for the UNDP project as mentioned. Although the activists have stood out to clarify that they are not demanding any partnership or matrimonial rights except respect for individuals. Earlier in February 2016, a member from the Indonesian Psychiatrists Association decided to announce that the association decided to reclassify homosexuality and transgenderism as mental disorders for the reasons that they are healable, they are treatable through psychiatric interventions. Since sexualities and gender identities are understood as being triggered by environmental factors. An association member stated that health professionals are worried that if left untreated, such sexual tendencies could become a commonly accepted condition in society. So it is the state's responsibility to provide proper interventions. This sounds like a rationale based on scientific discourse. However, concerned with the infectiousness of the problem, the commission actually stated that the decision's significance lies in upholding Indonesian traditions, which should not bow to the influence of foreign values. So we can see the contradiction between these 2 statements. In parallel, Malaysia's highest court showed support for a cross-dressing ban, and its prime minister once compared the Islamic State and LGBT people in a public speech in August 2015. He asserted that the LGBT issues are brainwashing the younger generation behind a mask of human rights to approve their acts which deviate from Islamic teaching. All of these narratives are operationalized to respond to an urgent need they feel, especially when the West has made international sexuality politics as a human rights issue. A Chinese lawyer once remarked on that. What the Chinese government, for example, is really concerned with is not human rights themselves, but the lecturing from other states, giving the room for intervention. That is to say, the international sexuality politics, or the politics of LGBT rights as human rights, is actually an intertwinement of domestic and international politics. The act of self-defense in a broad sense, following the effect of self-victimization for preserving national identity and sovereignty and cultural independence, is directed to sacrificing those who do not conform to the normals of the imagined community in domestic society. On the other hand, queerness, supposedly plural, becomes a definite threshold in circumscribing a state of exception as a battleground among genres of statecraft, between the liberal versus the authoritarian, between the progressive versus the conservative. Such a tension between the liberal West and others has been represented as the contradiction between the mainstream and others within other societies. And a focus on these intended countermeasures has actually in effect overshadowed the role of Western actors in spreading or at least feeling homophobia on domestic plane. Through these interactions, internationally and domestically, an assemblage composed of a twofold deployment of sexuality becomes a matter of a certain manipulation of relations of forces. It is in this context that the executive director of the APCON Thailand has urged activists in this regime to evade the artificial opposition between the developed versus developing, the progressive versus the conservative. Referring to the pink-washing Israel movement against Israelis' pink-washing actions, when talking about the situation in Brunei, the director accentuates the damaging effect of a misled focus on how to boycott, reject, and detest the diplomatic strategies of any country. We should pay more attention to places outside the metropolitan cities, he added. According to the director of the Sangsang Development Project in Thailand as well, more than 300 youth are sexual and gender variant, who are documented as incomplete citizens, living in Mae Kong Song and Tak provinces, which are bordering Myanmar. For these youths, for these young people who are landless or even stateless, what matters to them is not an identity, but how to live a life without fear and loss. For local queer activists, unlivable lives out of precarity experienced by these people may sufficiently justify a claim for human rights in relation to social justice, even without those sexual and gender identities as provided by the Western countries. However, along with the international process of legitimizing and legalizing LGBT rights as human rights, certain identity-based rights-holding status have traveled around the world from the West to Asia, of course. However, the queerphobic discourses and prejudice events are reproduced and occur in the search at the same time. This is saying, beyond the governmental level, the reactionary forces in society against the internationally popularization of LGBT rights advocacy emerge and develop really fast in the region, even in the societies which are considered as LGBT-friendly ones, for example, Taiwan and Japan. In this regard, queer activists who have been advocating the protection and promotion of rights in East Asia have become very careful in terms of wording and coding their needs into the rights language. For example, a replacement of LGBTI people with SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Also, with an awareness of the necessity to address ungeneralizable status quo for people of differential vulnerabilities, they have adopted an intersectionality approach to movement strategies. For example, the common language for queer people with listening disability in China, and disabled queer in Taiwan for queer Crips, according to them, who suffer multiple forms of marginalization and discrimination regarding both heteronormativity and able-bodiedness. Nonetheless, an activist from Indonesia once told me that when we framed it in the rights language, there had not been any progress. Particularly, this would be a problem if we consider that the contemporary international human rights law has made the states, the national governments, the eventual guarantors of rights protection, who are the most likely the violators themselves. In order to address the mixed feelings about the reliance on the state-centric international organizations and human rights regimes, the activists from Southeast Asia or in East Asia that I had conversation with all mentioned about the necessity to develop a more spontaneous, transcultural, and less confrontational approach to advocacy strategy and coalitional politics. For example, we are ASEAN too. To claim so, they have attempted to invite attention and support from other members in other societies. On the other hand, they also aim to build up a coalition of politics with activists from other countries. So many activists who I talked to at the Taiwan LGBT Pride from 2012 to 2016, especially those international participants, have expressed their envy of Taiwan's cheerful style of activism and participatory politics. Some told me that in their societies, it is better to keep it merely cultural, quieter, under table, especially when the rule of law, the law of formalist majoritarian democracy, is actually unreliable. What I came across is the silent change concluded by a Chinese activist lawyer. He compared two notable cases on transgender rights, respectively in Hong Kong and Nanjing, China. The former judgment given by Hong Kong court is more hostile to the transgender conditions when interpreting irrelevant laws, whereas the later case decided by the Nanjing court shows more sympathy to its plaintiff when there's no law. The lack of law unexpectedly created a room in which rights protection could be placed. He thus argued that the existence of law, on the one hand, shows the neglect of the state, while on the other hand, it actually evades the adversary impact of legal professionalism upon sexual and gender minorities. When we can imagine how bad the law would be if it exists. Such a vacuum beyond the government sides creates a negotiated space between the minority members and other majority members in society. According to an activist from TEA group in Thailand, no news is good news. What if the so-called democracy is based on a popular ideology which is actually homophobic? Merely cultural, bypassing the government, has twofold meanings. One implies the lack of attention from governments, and on the other hand, it also means the opportunities for translocal collaboration between people who share similar cultural beliefs and social repertoires. That is to say, queer activism in many places of Southeast Asia and East Asia is to familiarize the non-normativity, to cultivate a culture for subcultures, for example. The queer bike rally in Hanoi and Pink Dot event in Singapore. Leaving a room for the rule of no law is particularly important in places when a gap buffer between the governed, the governors, and the international society. Also, as mentioned earlier, with less attention from the international community, activists from Southeast Asia endeavor to build up a solidarity between themselves. A salient example can be the statement on the ASEAN Community Vision adopted by the ASEAN SOGI caucus. And ASEAN citizenship is forming as advocated by different marginal groups at the ASEAN Civil Society Conference and the ASEAN People's Forum. An activist from outright the Philippines mentioned that we are promoting a supranational and transcultural cohesion by creating a new identity. I'm an ASEAN. Being an ASEAN or Southeast Asian per se is an equivocal concept, but its primary spirit is to work in harmony. It has become a political discourse based on the solidarity of members from diverse backgrounds, seeking resonances from other marginal communities in order to enlarge the alliance. So you can tell this is very similar to the Rainbow Coalition strategies developed in Taiwan, which has connected other nodes to create expressively or implicitly an assemblage leveraging the inattentive or even hostile public. This is the reason why I consider these informal connections between activists in different societies and between activists themselves and between them and the people they represent as an assemblage. The coalition is composed by discrete communities. No one is strictly attached to anyone else. Every component still has its great autonomy, but no one can work without each other. As DeLanda coincidentally puts, these components form a backbone of many social justice movements. And more interestingly, these perspectives on social movements is very different from the conventional approach, such as unionist, Marxist, and feminist approaches, who take the oppression experience commonly shared by all, and the solidarity discourse as the starting point. Such activism has to be organized, analyzable, and seriously political since the beginning. Nonetheless, seeing a social movement as an assemblage does not reduce its political significance, I have to say. Rather, it takes the whole as dissectable, depending on the moments and their context in which the analysis intervenes. An assemblage interpretation, therefore, acknowledges the constant deterritorialization and re-territorialization of such an imagined community, which is not only unfixed, but also dissociable, despite the power and influence produced collectively and however divergently and sporadically. So to conclude, I would like to borrow Deleuze and Guattari's own words. Such coalitional effects and forces in different places would eventually demonstrate a constellation of voices prolongable by certain operations, which converge upon one or several assignable traits of expressions. And that's how changes have happened. So in fact, I'm not sure if you, the audience and organizers are aware. Today is an interesting choice of time for the talk. It's a Saturday morning here in Taiwan, and we will have our 18th Taiwan LGBT Pride this afternoon, following the second Trans Pride last night. So this moment articulates the two symbolic events of queer activism in Taiwan, while bearing in mind the new struggles facing LGBT people around the world because of the COVID pandemic. Through this articulation, with the material support of communication technologies, we're able to formulate a transnational relationship that link a big us at different locations, although I can't really see you guys here. Very loosely speaking, through sharing our observations and reflections, we are able to form an assemblage, although the productive effect is uncertain for now, but who knows, right? Thank you very much for your listening.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lee, for that very wide-ranging and provocative talk. I want to invite our audience to write your questions on the Q&A section. And I've got one. Let me read it to you. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. My question has to do with national essentialism, which has a long and complex history in Taiwan. The idea of nationalizing sexual identity and constructing Taiwaneseness have a strong resonance with the endeavor of defining a new Taiwaneseness following the expulsion of Taiwan from the UN in 1972 under the administration of Jiang Jingguo, which has a resonance with the imaginary of Taiwaneseness during the Japanese colonial period. I wonder how different or similar the trajectory of LGBT activities of Taiwan posit in this genealogy of national essentialism. Okay. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. So are we going to answer to this?
Answer to this first.
Okay, so honestly, I don't think I have a good answer to this question, which encompasses very broad range of historical moments and different interpretations of history. But I have to say what I observe between queer activists, especially in Taiwan, and also some Taiwanese activists in other countries, because there are some other queer activists in other countries. This is how I observe ambivalence, because a lot of them, on the one hand, they want to create a counter narrative against the essentializing sexual identity, national identity, all kinds of identity, which means they are very much deconstructing everything by rejecting, for example, a lot of historical traumas and those in effect influencing Taiwanese people at the moment. On the other hand, we can also see a really large group of people, because while fighting for Taiwan's independence, at the same time preserving the queer activism's leverage power, they have demonstrated really great contradiction sometimes between themselves, because as you also mentioned, the critique regarding nationalizing sexual identity and have resonance the colonial lineage in the past. So I have to say, I really don't have an answer to that, but I can say what I observe is that there are a lot of critical reflections between queer activists themselves. And also at different moment of the activism, when they are advocating sexual and gender minority rights, they also have to face the question regarding, in this regard, that a lot of people would ask them how they see themselves as part of Taiwanese and how they choose things between different positions, no matter geopolitical or historical. And that's how I observe ambivalence. And I can see strategically, sometimes they choose to evade the questions. But within the groups, between activists themselves, I know there are different debates happening all the time when these kind of questions happen. But thank you very much for the question. This can be a really good another starting point that we can explore in the future.
We have another very interesting question. The attendee writes, "Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for a fascinating presentation. Could you talk more about recent collective social activisms in Taiwan and across Asia? For example, you mentioned today's Pride Parade. So the recent social activism and how the pandemic has impacted the creativity, connected methods, and discourses."
Okay, so this is a very interesting, I think shows, okay, let me phrase it in this way. So Taiwan hasn't been really seriously impacted or not as bad as in all. So we can see Taiwan probably is the only country where LGBT pride can still happen on streets, not just virtually. And I have observed on social media a lot of voices and advocacies from Southeast Asian queer activists trying to support virtually, at the same time hope Taiwanese activists to convey and express their ideas and the sufferings they are facing during the COVID-19 as well. So this is why I mentioned that while it is very cheerful at the moment that all Taiwanese queer activists are very happy we still can have our pride. At the same time, it is also important to bear in mind that a lot of queer activists and also sexual and gender minority populations are facing very serious struggles in other countries, especially considering at the moment a lot of cities are still locked down, and it is really difficult for them to access to essential medicines and a lot of fundamental medical treatments. And also we can see, because a lot of government has mobilized war metaphors against COVID-19. By doing so, they have created some kind of nationalistic, very hostile narratives against minorities who are not cooperative in society, who are not productive in society, including sexual and gender minorities in many Asian cultures. So in the beginning of the pandemic, I also heard a lot of stories from Southeast Asian societies that activists, they found that a lot of sexual and gender minorities have been facing even more serious discrimination and even expulsion from their places than ever, because they are not included in the imagined community in terms of the war metaphor mobilized by the governments. And this is quite serious at the moment. So yeah, I think we have to keep observing and critiquing, especially from places where the situations are safer.
Thank you. Another question has come in, and this one asks you to speak to the case of India. The questioner notes that in your map of queer Southeast Asia activism, you really didn't talk about India. And so he wonders if you could bring that into your analysis.
I think a reason why I didn't intend to exclude India, but just because I didn't really have chance to have more deep conversations with activists from India, although I did have some interactions with activists from other South Asian countries, such as Bangladesh and Nepal. But honestly, I didn't have enough knowledge that I'm not confident in representing them in this presentation. So in the end, I'd rather not represent them in this, since it can reach to a larger audience and I don't want to misrepresent them. So that is probably the reason. I didn't intend to do it, but consciously, I try not to talk about the situations which I'm not really familiar with.
Thank you. So another question. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk, Professor Lee. In Taiwan, there's a lot of heterogeneity within LGBTQ plus groups and Christian groups, such as activists Chi Chao-wei's political inclination, which is very different from other LGBTQ activists, or the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan, which strongly supports LGBTQ rights. Could you please share more thoughts about how this heterogeneity influences the movements in Taiwan and other Asian countries?
Yeah. Okay, so I have to say all the questions today are quite difficult and but very important and interesting one. Actually, in an article that I wrote before, which was just the observation of the marriage equality campaign, the development of it in Taiwan, and I have to say, along the trajectory of developing marriage equality campaign, a lot of diversity and heterogeneity has been consciously overlooked and also even overshadowed just because of the single goal that has been set up by most of the LGBT people. Not really LGBT people, but mainly lesbian and gay populations. So honestly, I also have my reservations and critical reflections upon the situation, because we can also see how marriage rights discourse has hijacked a lot of other concerns, and also by making some figures, including Chi Chao-wei, Mr. Chi Chao-wei. I'm not saying he's wrong, because he's doing the thing that he thinks is right and good for most of people. However, by making these figures as heroes, it can be also very dangerous, because by doing so, we have to choose to neglect other concerns and other plural voices within the groups. just to serve the so-called larger goal. So I agree with you. I agree with this question that there are actually many different kinds of political stances on other issues, not necessarily for sexual and gender minority rights. However, I also have to say it can be really dangerous to forget what we have overshadowed just because of marriage equality. So this is why in this year, the Pride March and also the Trans March yesterday tries to bring back the issues that have been forgotten or that have been ignored intentionally because within these years. So I think it can be a good observing point in the future as well.
Thank you. So we have another question, but before that, someone asked me to announce that Taiwan's great Cloud Gate Taiwan Contemporary Dance Theater will be here in Chicago next September. And hopefully the pandemic will be over and we'll actually be able to enjoy that. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. And then we have a question. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Lee. In thinking about reading LGBTQ activism through a lens of human rights, I'm wondering how you think we should interpret the results of the 2018 referendum surrounding same-sex marriage. Specifically, do the results to some extent present a form of othering by placing same-sex marriage outside of Taiwan's civil rights language? Is this a detriment to the movement? And if so, what are ways to counter this moving forward?
Okay. Yeah, this is honestly, this is the question that I've been thinking of for a long time and how I can interpret it. Actually, I think the 2018 referendum exactly represents how much counter force or counter narratives against sexual and gender minority rights in Taiwanese society. So interestingly, slightly before the referendum, when the Supreme Court made the judgment in favor of same-sex marriage, I have to say that was the moment when the effect of the leveraging power of LGBTQ activism in Taiwan has been effective. I think that was how the alliance has shown its effect in this regard. However, it also showed later in 2018, we can see how little we have done in terms of engaging with the public. So there are a lot of misunderstandings and situations in which a lot of debates emerged and also misunderstand sexual and gender minorities. However, I also have to say, I think the 2018 can serve as a reminder for future queer activism that although now a lot of strategies have been focusing on engaging the public, but maybe that is not enough, especially if we observe the voting records in different cities. We can still see the divide between metropolitan and relatively rural areas. So we can also see the development of human rights discourse in Taiwan has been unequally distributed. And also the acceptance is unequally accepted as well. So perhaps that can be the next step of queer activism or other or other human rights-based social movements to work on, and also to bring up more voices from places outside larger metropolitan cities.
Thank you. While we're waiting for another question to come in, perhaps I could pose one of my own. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the relationship between feminist activists and LGBTQ activists. There've been a number of sort of high profile incidents. J.K. Rowling comes to mind, where people who are much admired say something that is transphobic. And so I wonder if you could sort of show us, tell us a little bit more about the nature of how that relationship has played out in Taiwan.
Okay. I think it is a very interesting question academically.
Mhm.
So, because I have to say the contradiction between feminism and LGBTQ activism is not even as salient as between feminists themselves.
Mm.
So it is interesting because I also observed that at least all of the feminist advocates, they are very supportive in terms of because linking to sex liberation and also gender equality, they are all very supportive. However, within feminism, they have their own interpretations regarding sexuality of women and also how the strategy regarding achieving gender inequality. So that can be categorized into radical groups and also more the group that attempts to use more normal strategies in terms of social movements. So there are different groups, and also they have been arguing against each other. However, interestingly, they have all shown great support for LGBT activism, including transgender intersex persons.
Mhm.
So, however, I also have to point out, a lot of times the debate between feminists, sometimes it's because of the ideologies regarding nationalism and also the cultural identities. So they are not necessarily always debating on academic or theoretical issues over women's rights or feminism themselves,
Mhm.
but from very different perspectives in terms of national and cultural identities, so that they see women's status and also how to live as a Taiwanese woman in a different way. So
Mhm.
it is a very intermingled situation, not only men against patriarchy, but also a Taiwanese woman against Chinese oppression or Taiwanese new nationalist oppression. So it is a very mingled situation in terms of the debate.
See, thank you.
No problem. It's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
And I always try to, how to say, unpack it, but after all, I always find it too complicated. So I repack it again myself.
So we have a bit of time left. I want to encourage some questions from our audience.
Or comments can be welcome too,
Or
right?
comments
If
can
they,
be welcomed as well.
yeah,
Yes, yes,
they have some observations that they want to share with us as well.
sure. Well, perhaps I could ask another question, if you don't mind. Um,
Yeah, no problem.
I'd like to know, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the two legal cases you brought up, the one in Hong Kong and the one in the Nanjing court. Uh, and I'm very intrigued by the idea of this, that, you know, a lack of a law can be actually um, strategic, I suppose.
Yeah. So actually, according to the law, the Chinese lawyer, he compared these two cases, which happened to be decided in the same year, almost around the same time. And it is very interesting because Hong Kong used to be colonized by the UK, right? So they
Mhm,
basically adopt the common law system, which has not been very friendly to transgender issues.
mhm,
And so even after after the colonization, even in the UK, a lot of rulings have changed the conventional ideologies regarding gender and sexuality issues. However, it doesn't mean the post-colonial societies will follow the transformation. And this was exactly what happened in Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, in that ruling, in terms of the transgender issues. So in that case, in the end, the Hong Kong Supreme Court applied an old ruling which hasn't been repealed. However, because in common law system, it's very strange situation that you can use legislation to address the problems in the ruling, but the rulings would be still continuously adopted if other countries found it necessary.
Mm.
Effective. So in the Hong Kong case, the court, since there is a ruling given by the common law system, so they still adopt the law and saying and denying the rights of transgender persons to change the person's birth certificate.
Mm.
However, in the Nanjing case, because in Chinese law, it's a continental law system, and which does not use case law on the one hand. On the other hand, so if the whole state, the parliament itself has never come across the issues regarding transgender, and then the transgender issues are subject to no law. And in that sense, in that case, the Nanjing court, the judges, so it totally depends on luck, because the judges themselves can be very hostile as well and applying other laws and to restrict the rights and freedoms of the person. However, today it was very lucky that the Nanjing court judges and the judge decided to apply other law that is given by family law and also civil right and civil law to not promote, but to declare that those rights can be interpreted, can be applied to the situation of the transgender person. So it was extensively and flexibly interpretation of other law to the specific case, because there was no law at all regarding transgender persons.
Mm.
So which gives a room for the judges, if they are friendly enough and they show sympathy towards the plaintiff, so that they can decide, if there's no law binding upon them, they can decide how to interpret other laws. And in the end, it gives a favorable judgment to the transgender persons who were seeking to change birth certificate as well.
Mm.
So it was very interesting. When there was no law, you still can play by luck.
Sure.
Yeah. So but I wouldn't say it's a sustainable way of doing this, because then you give all the power to the judges depending on what kind of personalities and ideologies they possess. So
Yeah.
it can be a danger as well. However, just within these cases, we suddenly see how no law can sometimes be used as the way to do activism strategy.
Thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. And we don't have any questions right now. So let me end, first of all, by thanking you so much, Professor Lee. It was a wonderful talk and really makes me want to go back and read Deleuze again. Oh, actually, I have a question that just came in. Lovely. Thank you, Professor Lee. Brilliant talk. Can you give some comments or thoughts on the application of Puar's notion of homonationalism that has been used by some activists to critique Taiwan?
That is a very interesting question. I think there has been a debate between academics in terms of whether it is really appropriate to use this critique applying to the situation in Taiwan. And honestly, from my perspective, I don't think these two cases are even comparable, because when Puar was talking about homonationalism, basically she was analyzing the situations in the United States and also Israeli situation against Palestinians, and in that sense, these are the states using using their state power and international influence against minorities who don't have national status. On the other hand, in the Taiwan's case, because I'm also familiar with this kind of critique. However, in the Taiwan's case, as I mentioned, for me, Taiwan's existence in international politics is actually queer itself, because it doesn't really possess a national status and its sovereignty hasn't been granted or recognized by whole international community. So it is really difficult to link, even it's more progressive in terms of queer activism, but to link this to nationalism is, for me, it's impossible when it doesn't really have leverage power as United States, as Israeli have in international politics. So what I actually observe is how Taiwanese queer activists teaching or sharing their own activism strategies with activists in other societies in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. So there are a lot of informal and unofficial, unpolitical connections and interactions between activists. However, this has been very difficult for a nationalist agenda. So we can see, even no matter how much Taiwan has claimed first in Asia in terms of marriage equality, however, first of what? No one dares say anything. It is not like first country, first nation in Europe or in America. It is only first. So no one dares say what it comes first. So also this implies that no matter how much Taiwanese government or Taiwanese people try to promote and try to link LGBT activism to our national pride, it doesn't really create any political leverage for Taiwanese government in international community. So for me, it is, I mean, not just incomparable, I wouldn't even think they are relevant in terms of the theory given by Boer's nationalism. But of course, other people have very, very, very extensive and broad interpretation of homo nationalism. Then I wouldn't say that's the Boer's version anymore. But maybe other theories, they have come across other types of homo nationalism in their own way. Yeah.
Thank you. And there's another question that just came in. Your comment about first in Asia just now made me think of comments you made in your Kyoto Journal article last December. And then an FYI, Wen Liu and Charlie E. Zhang have a forthcoming book chapter critiquing homo nationalism as applied to Taiwan that some people here might find interesting.
Oh, I am very curious about that chapter now. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. I'm looking forward to its publication.
Me too. Well, now we truly are out of time. So again, let me thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. I hope that at some point we can have you come to our campus and talk more about your work. It'd be really exciting.
Yeah, it will be my pleasure and honor to. And also, I'm really happy today that just before going to the Pride, beforehand, I can share my observations with previous Pride events. And this feels really interesting.
Yes, I mean, the date couldn't have been better now that we know that this talk was sandwiched between the Trans Pride Parade and the Pride Parade this afternoon. Excellent.
Yeah, what a coincidence, right?
Yeah, what a coincidence.
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, It was totally our pleasure. And I'm a huge fan of your work. So it was great to finally meet you and hear what you're working on these days.
Yeah.
So let me say thank you to our audience. You were wonderful. And I just want to give a plug for another upcoming event. There will be another Spotlight Taiwan lecture series and presentation on November 30th at 7:30. And the speaker will be Dr. Yen Chen Ying, who will be talking about the everlasting bloom, rediscovering Taiwanese Modern Art. This program will focus on a current exhibit at the Museum of the National Taipei University of Education that Dr. Yen is curating. And this, exhibition runs through January 2021. And if you go to the chat box, you can see more information about this and also register for the event. So thank you all very much for coming. And again, thank you, Dr. Lee. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone from the center. Thank you all.
Everybody stay safe. And if you're here in the US, have a happy Halloween tomorrow.
Happy Halloween. Yes, stay safe. That's the most important thing.
That's the most important part. Unfortunately, we're still in the midst of our pandemic here.
I know, please stay safe and take care.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
that's-
everybody, if you're in the United States, don't forget to vote, please. Your vote counts.
Yeah.
Thank you and good night.
Okay, bye.
Bye.